Hey, Tim Clapham here for fxphd, and this is the first week of the Cinema 4D 215 course. And as you can see, I've got Cinema 4D open. Now I'm using Cinema 4D release 15, but this will work in any version from release 12 onwards. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at how we can create some dynamic object along a spline using connectors, so they're kind of hinged onto the spline. And then once we've had a look at the basic principles of that, we're going to move on and create the same setup but with some type. So first of all, I'm going to come in, I'm just going to add in a rectangle spline, and let's set this to be a little bit bigger, around 600 by 600, and set the plane to be XZ. Next, set the intermediate points to be uniform. Now this isn't essential, but what that does is it sets all the intermediate points on our spline to be spaced with a uniform distance between them, and this helps to keep the clones that we are going to distribute across this spline distributed in a uniform manner. Now, of course, that depends on the way that you clone them onto the spline, but it's often helpful to set your splines to uniform. Also want to enable rounding, so we've got some nice round corners, and let's set that to 150, and there we go. You can see we've got our rectangle spline. Next thing I'm going to do is come up and just add a cube, and let's call this top cube. And we can set this to be, say, 5 units. So if we just click on the word size, type in 5, and then hit Control and hit return, and you can see that changes all of the highlighted parameters at once. Let's grab this cube, Control drag to create another one, and let's call this bottom cube. Okay, and I'm going to set this to be 25. And if we just switch to our side view, and let's just grab this and hold down Shift, and let's just place this, say, 50 units below. Select the top cube, hold down the Alt key, and if we then add in a null object, which I've got in my layout here, but otherwise you can choose Create Object Null, and just by holding down Alt means that the selected object becomes the child, and you can see that the null and the top cube are in exactly the same place. We also want to grab our bottom cube and just drop that into the null in the same level of hierarchy, so don't make that a child of the top cube. So here we have our null. If we hold down the Alt key and come up to the MoGraph menu and add in a cloner object, and let's just call this cloner cubes, switch to the object tab, and instead of using the linear mode, let's change that to object, and we can drag our rectangle spline into this field. If we switch back to perspective, you can see that all of our cloned objects are kind of pointing upwards, and really I want them to point down. I want them to act as if they're hanging from the spline. And the reason for this is simply because of the direction of the spline. Every spline has a start and an end point, and depending on that direction, that will determine the orientation of the clones when they're cloned along that spline. So we can select our rectangle spline, and we can enable the reverse option. Now it hasn't actually done anything here, but if we just force a refresh, you can see that they now jump around and they're oriented the correct way. If we grab our cloner, we can then animate the offset parameter, and you can see that our clones move around the spline. So let's just Control click to create a keyframe for offset at 0 on frame 0, and then let's come to, say, frame 100. And I'm actually going to set my project to be 250 frames all in. So we set the last frame to be 249 because we're actually starting on frame 0. And now we're on frame 100. Let's set our offset to be, say, 30 and add another key. And then let's just come forward a little bit more to around, say, 140. And let's animate the offset back slightly. So let's set that to 20, add another key, and then let's jump to the very end, and let's add one more key and set that to be 40. Okay. So there you can see all of our keys, and if we scrub through, or we press play, you can see that the clones travel around, and at this point it reverses back and then it carries on. Now you might notice that there's a little bit of stepping here as it goes around the corner. Now there's a few reasons for that. Maybe they're aren't enough points on our spline, so we can increase the number here. You can see that does help, but there's actually an option in the cloner. When you clone onto splines, or if you use a spline effector, we have this smooth rotation parameter here. And more often than not, if you enable that, that will fix those kind of stepping or jerky rotation moments. So you can see we've got our objects traveling around the spline. Nothing too exciting at the moment, so let's just stop, rewind. And what we can do now is we can make these dynamic so that we add a bit of inertia so that they're affected by the motion. Now if we select both of these cubes, right click and choose simulation tags and add a rigid body to both of these objects. Now if we press play, you can see that what happens is dynamics totally takes over and they forget that they're attached to that spline and they just drop down. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that they stay attached to this. And one way we can do that is we can set our top cube so that it is no longer dynamic. We still need to keep the dynamics body tag on there because what we want to do is we want to connect these two together. So we select this tag, switch to the dynamics tab, and here where it has dynamic we can just set that to off. So that's now a collision object essentially. But because it has a dynamics tag, it means that it will work with the dynamics engine. So what we then need to do is we need to connect this top cube to our bottom cube. Let's just rewind to the beginning, press play again. You can see now our top cube stays on the spline, but of course there's no link between those objects and dynamics takes over and the bottom cube simply drops down. So to connect those, we use what's called a connector, and a connector has several options. You can use it as a hinge, as a ragdoll, as a ball socket. You can use it as a sliding connector. There are all sorts of parameters on there. So let's just switch our cloner off for a moment so we can see our top and bottom cube. And if we select those two and press O to frame them, what I want to do here is I want to just select my top cube. Now this is actually at world 0 anyway, so I could just add a connector and it would be in the right place. But if this was somewhere else in space, then if we just hold down Shift, come to the simulation menu and choose dynamics and add a connector, it then places it as a child, and we can then zero out our parameters so that we know it's in exactly the right place. Because we're at world 0, it's just added in at the correct place anyway. Now the shape of this gives us an idea of what this connector is going to do, but if we switch to the object tab, you can see here that the type is set to hinge, and we have all sorts of options in here. So we can choose ball and socket, or we could choose a slider, and you can see that the representation of the connector changes as we change the type of connector. I'm going to set that back to hinge. We can also switch to the display tab and we can choose for it to always be visible, because if we deselect our connector, it disappears. If we choose to have it always visible, then of course it's always visible, and that's sometimes useful for debugging, etc. We can also change the size of it, so let's just set this to be, say, 20, so it's a bit smaller. Now what I do want to do is I want to rotate this so that the connector swings in the right direction for my cubes. If we disable this connector just for a moment, and let's enable the cloner, pull out slightly, you can see that as we go around the corner, we just need to actually disable this dynamics tag for a sec. As we go around the corner, you can see that the cubes orient themselves correctly to their direction of travel. If we select this bottom cube and we just say size Z, let's just make size Z a little bit bigger, and you can see that the orientation is along the Z axis. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that our connector is rotated so that it will swivel along the correct axis. So let's just set that back to 25, and I'm going to just enable my dynamics tag, switch that cloner off and bring that connector back up. So if we come in here and have a look, if we select our top cube, you can see this is the Z axis and our connector is also oriented that way. So we need to just grab this and rotate it around 90 degrees so that it can swivel along the correct axis. Now of course the connector itself needs to know which objects it's connecting, and at the moment it's just sitting here and we haven't told it which objects to link. So if we select the connector and switch to the object tab, here you can see that we can link in an object A and an object B. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my top cube, put that into object A, and I'm going to take my bottom cube and put that into object B. As soon as you do that, you can see that what happens is we get this line that shows us the connection between those objects. So if I just press E to bring up my move tool and just pull my connector back, so we get a nice straight line between those two objects. And now we should have a dynamic link between the top cube and the bottom cube. If we press play now, you can see that that bottom cube doesn't fall. If we rewind, disable the connector and press play, you can see that that bottom cube does in fact fall. So with the connector active, this bottom cube is still dynamic, but the connector is linking them both together. If we enable our cloner, so we have them all the way around our spline, when we hit play, you can see that now what's happening is the bottom cube doesn't drop down due to dynamics, but because we're using a dynamics engine, as the objects move along the spline, the movement creates inertia and it swings around on the hinge. So we get this really nice organic natural motion. So this is the basic principle of the next section of the class, where we're going to actually build something similar to this, but we're going to use typography. And we're going to look at how we can use this connector with many letters, how to kern those letters, and how to attach them to a chain link. So probably a good idea to save your project if you haven't done so. We're already part of the way, so let's continue in the same scene and let's just adapt what we've got to accommodate our type. And we're also going to build a chain link. So what I want to do is create a more interesting path than this. I'm going to take my rectangle. First of all, let's just control click here to just switch all of those elements off. With this rectangle, I'm just going to uncheck rounding and press C to make that an editable spline. If we uncheck close spline, you can see we now get a gap here. We can then switch to our points mode. If we then grab this point, hold down control and pull, we then can create a little bit more of an interesting path. I'm just going to delete this point here, grab this point here and just pull that along. If we then select these 2 points, switch to our top view and let's just press S to frame those, pull out a little bit more. And now we can right click and choose chamfer, and then if we drag we can chamfer those corners. I'm actually going to use a value of 150 just as we had before, so we get this nice smooth curve. And if we press O to frame that object, you can see the path that we've created. So let's just call this our path spline. Set to uniform 32 points. Okay. Now included with the download there should be a file which is called ChainGang, and you need to open that file. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up here and choose File, Merge Objects and load in that ChainGang Cinema 4D file. You can see that by choosing File Merge in the Object Manager, it will merge those splines into this scene rather than us having to bring them into another scene and copy and paste them. Let's just select all of those and press O so that we can frame them, and then let's just rotate around and have a look. Now here's a really handy little method of creating a whole bunch of extrudes and having them take on the axes of each spline and also to take on the name of each spline, and we only need to set up one extrude. So what we can do is we come up and we add an extrude object. Let's grab all of these splines that make up the word ChainGang, drop them in. Now by default you can see that what happens is the extrude NURBS object only takes the first spline into account and all of the rest of them ignored. But if we come to the object tab of the extrude object and there's a hierarchical checkbox, we can check that, and that will then use the full hierarchy of splines. So I'm going to set the movement to be, say, 10, and I'm going to come to the caps and let's select both of these, set that to be fillet cap, and also let's just set the radius to be about 0.5. That just gives us a little bit of a bevel. If we come to our materials, let's just double click to create a material, and we'll call this one white, and let's just make this pure white. Let's just double click, add another one, and let's call this one red, and let's make this red. So we're not really worrying about the aesthetic of this project. I'm going to switch off the specular just so we have this nice flat color. Let's drag the red onto our extrude. Let's drag the white on here. And for the white, under selection, let's just press C1, which is cap 1. And that will then restrict the white. Oops, it needs to be a 1, not an exclamation mark. And there we go. And you can see that now we'll be able to see our type nice and clearly as we work through the project, rather than that dark grey blue colour that it defaults to. We need each of these letters to be separate extrude objects, and this is where the magic of using the hierarchical this hierarchical checkbox comes in. Because we've got the name on each spline, when we make this editable, if you have the hierarchical checkbox enabled, it will essentially create a separate extrude object for each spline, which is pretty handy. So if we just press C, you can see that, and when we fold this down, we now have all of those extrudes set up. The only thing that it didn't copy our textures. But what we can do is we can right click on the texture here, and we could just choose copy tag to children, and then on the right, copy tag to children. The problem with that is that it puts them the wrong way around. So let's just undo, and let's just undo again, and let's just do the white first, copy tag to children, and then copy this to children. And there we go. And now if we take these out of the hierarchy, we can get rid of that null that's left behind. I'm going to save my project at this point. We've got the text. Now let's make a chain to attach this to. Now we have our path spline here, so we can use that to create our chain. So we need to create some links to go on our chain. I'm just going to control drag across all of those ticks just to hide that for now. Come up and add in a rectangle spline. If we add some rounding, and let's just set that rounding to the max, and then if we let's set the width to 200, and then we have a kind of chain link shape. With this selected, hold down the Alt key, come up and add in a sweep. And if we then hold down Shift and add in a circle, we then start to see our big chunky chain link. So I'm going to press T for scale. I'm just going to scale that down. So it's something like so. And we can call this, you guessed it, chain link. Now you do need to be a little bit careful, because we're going to have hundreds of these, and in certain scenes maybe even thousands. And if this was part of a complex scene, you're going to increase your polygon count hugely, because the circle itself has lots of intermediate points, and we also have to check how many on our rectangle. And one way of doing this, of course, is to change the display mode. So if we just set that to quick shading lines, you can see all of these segments that we have, which are essentially polygons. Even though it's a parametric object, they will be polygons at render time. And that's very, very dense. And if you imagine it's going to be quite small, we certainly do not need that many. So we can control how many segments going around by our circle. So if we set this to, say, uniform, and then as we decrease the number of points, you can see the number of segments decreases. So I'm just going to set that to uniform 1, and we can see now that we have gone from thousands of polygons to hundreds. If we select the rectangle, we can do the same here. And if we just increase that angle, and I'm going to set that to say 25. And you might be thinking, oh my goodness me, that's a bit of a low res chain link. But if you were going to be rendering it up close, then obviously you wouldn't reduce the detail that much. But we're going to be cloning it along this spline, and I can imagine that it's going to be pretty small once it's on there. So we probably don't need that much detail. And if we leave everything parametric as it is, it's very easy to come in and adjust those parameters and increase the detail if we need to. So with that chain link selected, hold down the Alt key, and let's come up and add in a cloner, and we'll call this cloner chain link. And I'm going to set this to object, and I'm going to drag in my path spline. Now the path spline itself is set to uniform, which is good, because by default, that means that our segments are uniformly distributed along here. Now, of course, our chain link is much, much too big, but also it's oriented in the wrong way. Now, the easiest way to fix that is actually to come to the rectangle that we have in here, and we can change the plane. So we could set that to be ZY, for instance, or we could set that to be XZ. XZ looks to be perfect. Next thing we might want to do is just grab our chain link itself, press T, and then let's just scale that down. I'm going to scale that down to, say, 20, maybe even 10% of the size. No, somewhere in between, around 15. If we just come back to our quick shading mode, you can see all of our chain links. So we're going to need quite a few more on here. So let's select the cloner and let's just increase the count. And we want them to just intersect each other like so. Perhaps not even quite as much, so we can reduce the count. You could set this to step and then adjust the distance between them. Now the nice thing about using step is if you then adjust the size of your spline, then that distance will stay the same, whereas if you use count, if you adjust the spline at all, then the count will stay the same. So if the spline gets shorter, then they will become more condensed, and if the spline gets longer, then they will start to get gaps between them. Now of course there is obviously one big problem with this chain, is that the links aren't linked correctly. We need to rotate every other link. And we can do that fairly easily just by using a simple formula in the formula effector. So with that cloner selected, choose MoGraph effector and add in the formula effector. Now the formula effector by default has this funky formula in here which uses a sine wave based on time to control the position and the scale. And if we press play, we get this really cool sine wave traveling through our links. It may be cool, but it's not what we want. So let's just delete that out of there. And I'm going to switch off position, switch off scale, and enable rotation. Now what we do want to do is we want to affect every other clone, and we can do that really easily just by using the modulus function. So in the formula here, we just type MOD, and we open parenthesis, and we choose ID, and ID refers to the ID of the clone. And you can fold these variables down, and it tells you here ID is the object index. So in other words, it's the number of the clone, which starts at 0 and then increases. And we want this formula to affect every other clone, so every second clone. So we put ID semicolon 2, and then we just close those parentheses. That's all we need to do. And now if we grab our rotation bank, we should be able to rotate this, and there we go, and you can see that that's now offsetting every other clone. And that's a really cool little formula to remember, even if you're not that mathematically minded, which I'm not, but I use that quite often. For instance, if you want to create something like a brick wall where you want every other layer to be offset, again you would use you'd use that exact same formula. So now we have our chains, we have our type, and we have our clones here, which are also linked to this path spline. What we need to do is we need to take this setup and we need to create a similar setup, but one for each of our letters. If we just hide our cloner chain link by just double click on that top traffic light, let's select the cloner cubes, and I'm going to just shift control click on this animation dot, and that will remove all the animation keys and the track, etc. I'm going to set the mode to be linear, and we need the same count as we have letters. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we set this to 9. Okay, and as I mentioned before, the clones will be linked to the spline along the z-axis, so we need to set our distribution along z. So let's just come down here so we can actually see, and let's just increase this. I'm going to set that to say 25, maybe 50. Okay, there we go. So we have our cubes that we've already set up. If we add in another cloner, let's just grab our chain gang type, drop that into here. We're going to set this to 9 as well. We have the mode, the clones parameter set to iterate, so it's going to iterate through each one of these one after another. And let's set our Z here to be 50. Okay, and there we go, and you can see we now have all of our chain gang, but the letters aren't oriented the correct way. So if we come to the transform tab, we can adjust the rotation here, and let's set that to 90. If we grab this cloner, make sure you've got the move tool. Let's switch to our front view and frame that object. If we now pull this down, we can position this more or less where our original cubes from the setup underneath are. Okay. Let's select this top cube and let's just Alt double click on these traffic lights so that that doesn't get seen in the editor and it won't render as well. It's just there purely to be a dynamic object for linking to. The bottom cube we're going to get rid of. We're going to replace that with all of these letters. Select the top cloner and let's just press C to make that editable, and that's really just going to distribute our extrudes so that they're in exactly the right place for our cubes. And you can notice that Cinema very helpfully puts on a number for each of these, which I don't particularly want, but we'll just ignore that. Let's select our cloner cubes and let's press C here as well. If we open that up, you can see we now have all of those. And what we want to do is we want to delete our bottom cubes first of all. So a quick way to do that is to just bring up our search and just type bottom. We can then select all of those and delete them. Now if we grab our C and let's just drop these in, and you want them to be in the same level. You don't want to drop them as a child, you want them to be in the same level so they're inside that null. So let's just do C and we just go through and do all of these. Now the one thing that we do need to make sure we do is we need to make sure all of these are dynamic objects, and at the moment they are not. So there we go. Okay, so now we have all of those. And what we want to do is, as I say, we want to make those dynamic. So let's just come up here, and it probably look like this for you. If you fold this down, you can see we can see our extrude objects. If we just control click on this eyeball, it will solo all of the extrude objects in our scene. So now we've got those visible, we can select all of those nice and easily, right click, choose simulation tags, rigid body. And then if we just control click on the top eyeball for objects, that then shows all of our objects again. We can then hide that filter. So now if we just control click to fold all of that up, we have all of our null objects, and each one of these has a connector and an extrude in place. What we need to do now is select the connectors. Because we deleted the bottom cube, we need to just drag in the appropriate letter for each connector. So we're going to link that top cube to our extrude instead. And we should get exactly the same behavior that we had before with the cubes, but this time with our type. And if we just come down to the last one, and there we go. And if we select these connectors, you can see all of the connections seem to be working correctly. Cool stuff. Delete this top null that's left over from where we made our cloner editable. We don't need that. And if we select this cloner with all of our letters in, we can press Shift G to just expand that object group, and we can delete that too. Let's come to the MoGraph menu, add in a cloner, and we call this one cloner type. Grab our nulls, drop them into here. Now the cloner type here, under the Object tab, set the count to 9 so it corresponds to the number of letters. We don't want them moving up like that. Let's just set Z to 50 so it's the same as before. Now you notice that the kerning is pretty bad. The distribution is basically even, but we'll have a look at how we can fix that in a moment. Now with this cloner selected, let's unhide our chain link. The links are probably a bit too big, but never mind, we'll leave it like that for now. But with that cloner type selected, choose MoGraph effector. Let's add in a spline effector. Now I like to drag my effectors so they're underneath the cloner because the order of execution starts at the top and runs down. So if we put the effector after the cloner, then It kind of makes more sense logically. Select the spline effector, and in the spline field we need to drag our path spline, and then let's just pull out and see what's happened. Okay, so you can see that everything is distributed along the spline, which is what we'd expect, but it's not looking exactly how we like. Now, one of the things we can do is we can drag this end parameter here, and we can pull this along so that all of our type is nice and close together, like so. But of course we have the problem that it's actually upside down, and obviously we need to fix that. Under the effector tab of the spline effector, I'm going to change the mode. It's currently set to step, but I'm going to set this to relative. Now, relative is really useful if you have a relative spacing between your types. So if you're using like a motext object and you needed to maintain that relative spacing as you attach your text to a spline, then you would use the relative option. Unfortunately, we set our cloner up using a linear clone, so the kerning is already screwed, and we're going to have to fix that a different way. But relative is useful for that thing, but we do need to set the correct axes. Now, as we set this up to be along the z-axis, it would make sense to set that to be plus z, and you can see there now we have our chain gang. So what we need to do is just switch to the parameter tab, and we should be able to just adjust the rotation here. So let's set that to 90, and now our type is indeed hanging down. So I'm going to come to the chain link here and grab this chain link. It's much too big. Let's just make that quite a bit smaller. I'm also going to just change this so it's white so we can see that. If we just come in a little bit closer, and let's just adjust the step amount like so. Now, it'd be nice that as we animate the chain that our type moves with it, and the easiest way to do that is just to simply link the offset parameter. We've got offset here, and we have offset on our spline effector, depending on which one we want to animate, depending on how we link it up. So if we say we're going to animate the chain link, let's take this object and choose tags and add in an espresso tag. Let's drag this in, and we choose object properties offset, drag in the spline effector, and on the input we choose parameter. No, I'm sorry, it's under effector offset, and then link those together. So now if we grab our cloner chain link, if we animate the offset on here, you can see that also animates the type. So we've linked the two together, which is great. So on frame 0, let's add a key for our offset. Move to, say, frame 100, and let's set that offset to be, say, 30. Add a key. Let's come forward to, say, 140. And let's set that to be 20. Just so that we have a little bit of backwards and forwards motion. Obviously, it's not really going to make much sense. What you'd probably want to do is bring it along and park it in place and just have a little bit of a jiggle as it lands, just to make that motion more effective. And I'm going to set the offset to 40 on the last frame. You can see now this is all looking a bit jumbled, but when we rewind to the beginning, it should be okay. Let's come up and choose Save Incremental, and then we can press play. Okay, and there we go, and you can see that we're getting that same effect with our chain gang. It's not actually going around the corner, which is quite funny. Oh, there we go, it does go around the corner. We're going to end up just on the corner. So, of course, we could come to our timeline. Let's just drag all of these up a bit. Something like so. And now, hopefully, it will end up in place. And you could use a different type of connector there, maybe a ball and socket, so that you get more rotation on the letters. It depends on the final result you're after. Let's just take this final key and make that maybe, say, 75. Something like so. So there we go. That's the basic setup. Everything's working as expected. Hopefully that gives you some ideas for some of your own projects. But before we end this class, we do need to take a bit of a look at the issue that we have with kerning. So what we can actually do is we can use effectors to control the position of these, and if we add those effectors after the spline effector, we can then move them backwards and forwards along Z. So if we select our cloner type, what we really need to do is we need to bring the I a little bit closer, and then we need to bring the C, H and the A bit closer as well. We can do that using MoGraph selections. So come to the MoGraph menu, choose MoGraph selection, and you can see that the selection is based on the axes of the object, which is the position of these nulls. So what we want to do is just drag across these four like so, so they go yellow, and it creates this tag for us. And let's just call this CHAI. They're the letters that it's affecting. And with that MoGraph selection tag selected, choose MoGraph effector plane, add in a plane effector. And by default it moves them on Y 100 units, so we just need to zero that out. And now we can grab the Z parameter and we can just pull that across. So if we just set that to say 11, select the cloner again, grab our MoGraph selection, and this time let's select these three letters. Make sure that you don't have your selection tag active, otherwise you'll overwrite the selection. Let's select this and we'll call this one CHA. Again, we'll add in a plane effector, and let's just set that to 10 or 11. Obviously you can spend a little bit more time doing that. Also, you probably want to name your effectors so that the name of the objects makes sense. Otherwise you're going to end up with millions of effectors. So here we should probably call this formula rotate 90 degrees, and then these should be, kern, something like so. And that brings us to the end of the class, and as you can see we now have a working solution. We have a chain that as it animates, our type is linked to the movement. The type is all dynamic, swinging on hinges. You could add little hooks in here. Hopefully that's given you some ideas for some of your own projects, and if you enjoyed that, hope you take next week's class too. And next week we'll be working with type again, but it'll be a totally different setup. We'll be looking at flowing type, how we can flow type along a spline for creating words from things such as maybe spaghetti or string or ribbons or shoelace. So it'll be a lot of fun, and we'll also be looking at some solutions to if we have problems with the deformation along the spline messing up the look of our logo, and how we can add in some correctional morphs, or maybe use things like the inheritance effector to solve those kind of issues. So it should be a lot of fun. If you've got any questions regarding this week's class, please post it on the forums and I will do my best to answer them. Other than that, have a great week, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you.